Hey, welcome to day 13. Wow, day 13 in this series on self-sufficiency. And today what I'm going to talk about is an element of property design. Okay, so an element of property design that is called the scale of permanence. Okay, and I'll get to that here in just a minute. But you might ask yourself, property design, what does that have to do with self-sufficiency? It has everything to do with self-sufficiency. How you set up your property, how you design it, where you place elements, how it flows can be the difference between a property that's very poorly functioning and requires lots and lots of inputs and work, or something that works very low maintenance and doesn't require a lot of inputs. Okay, those are huge differences, and so we want to design our properties in a way that they are low maintenance, require less inputs, and are more self-sufficient. Okay, because that's what it's all about, is setting it up properly. And I'm going to use an example because there can be you have a kind of a road that you can travel on self-sufficiency when it comes to property design, and then there's a ditch on either side of the road. Okay, so I'm going to use an example as an analogy. So think about water. We spend a lot of time on water here because it's so important. And on the one hand, someone can set up their property and design it, and they could have a great, beautiful place, but then they are completely 100% dependent on their well. Okay, and they've got a well, and the grid power runs the well. And if they lose power through an ice storm or whatever, they immediately lose their water. Okay, and they don't have a generator, for example, to back up the grid power, or they don't have other sources of water, etc. And then they're out of it. They're out of the game. They're done from go. Okay, from right away. Okay, so they've got a well. It's a great producing well. It's wonderful. Power goes out, they're done. Okay, they've got whatever water is in their, their system, their pressurized system in the home. All right. Okay, that's obviously not good. On the other hand, you've got other people who say live completely off grid, and they are, they can do a lot. They have a lot of skills. I mean, they're living off grid. But there's a trap on that side too. Okay, there's a ditch on that side too. A lot of people, like we'll see people that live off grid, but that have to go to the county campground to get water. Okay, or you know what I mean. So they're literally shipping in water, or they bucket water from a water source. Let's say a pond. Okay, so they can literally bucket water from a pond, put it through appropriate filtration systems like a Berkey, and they've got good water. Okay, and that's fine, right? That's the lifestyle they want to live, and they can do that. But what I would say is the person who is living totally off grid, and that's either getting their water from the campgrounds or they're bucketing their water, is why wouldn't they set up better systems? Right? They can always fall back on bucketing water, right? They can always fall back to getting water and bringing water in from the campground. But why start there? Why make that your plan to begin with? In some cases, it's almost like a badge of honor for them, that that they live very Spartan-like. Again, totally fine, but in my mind, it's like those people, they spend a lot of time doing very, very basic fundamental things instead of designing it in a way where they can still live totally off grid, be completely self-sufficient, and but make it easier on themselves. Right? You could have a simple, for example, a little bit of a solar system with a solar pump to a cistern that can move water from the pond to a cistern. That makes it so much easier for them. And then again, right, fall back. If that fails, go bucket water. Okay, etc. And then obviously, I've talked about many times the ditch on this side. where someone that does not have redundant systems, they do not have a primary, secondary, and a tertiary way of getting water. Okay, so that's why I think it's important to consider property design for self-sufficiency, right? We need time to be able to do things. So we want to try and automate systems as much as possible, or simplify systems as much as possible. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is a piece of property design, and that is the scale of permanence. All right, so let's get into the scale of permanence and how it factors into design. And first of all, the design is a huge discipline. I'm not going to be able to teach design in this series to any extent. However, I will give you a lot to think about, and a framework that will help you to take next steps, make decisions when it comes to property, setting things up. Okay, so one of the most important things is, where do you place things? Okay, where should the gardens go? Where should the barns go? Where should the orchard go? Where should the edible forest garden go? Etc. And there's a lot to that, right? There's all the solar aspect. There's the flow of the property. There's access. There's structures. There's existing things. There's things that you got to make, right? There's things that are already in place when you bought the property, and right, you're not going to change certain things. Okay, so that relates to this whole scale of permanence. And the scale of permanence was first brought about, to my knowledge, by P.A. Yeoman, and when it came to keyline design. Okay, he was an Australian, excellent designer, wonderful books about all that, and he came up with this scale of permanence. So in thinking about the design of a farm, you have certain things that are more permanent than others, and it helps us to inform us on design and framework. Okay, and then the other people came along and they modified it to a certain degree, made it more applicable to kind of what they were doing. So there was Dave Jackie, and I think it was Eric Tonesmeyer, who wrote Edible Forest Gardens Volume 1 and 2, if I'm not mistaken. And they modified it to some degree, and then there's other people that are doing outstanding work that have modified it to what they're doing. So there is one in particular is called Regrarians, and they are Australians as well. And it's a company, it's a farm type design company, and they are obviously heavily influenced by Yeoman as well. And they've modified it into a similar model or framework. And that's what I'm going to cover with you real quick. Their framework. So the Regrarians platform is what they call it. But it really is based on this whole idea of scale of permanence. And then the first one is climate. Okay, so the climate. What is the climate that you live in? What types of things are you capable of doing in that climate, right? I mean, I'm up here in North Idaho at 48 degrees north latitude, and people they want to grow food year round up here. Okay, that can be done, but it is very difficult, and of course it depends on what you're trying to do. So like if somebody comes up here in North Idaho and they're gonna well, I'm gonna get a Harbor Freight greenhouse and I'm gonna grow food year round. No, you're not. Okay, not unless you put a massive amount of energy into that, to where you're literally paying like 10 times the amount of food that you could have just bought from the store. And they might say, yeah, but preparedness, blah, blah, blah. And I'd say, yeah, you're right. But if you can't get food from the store, what's to say that you're going to have that amount of energy to put into that type of system where you could actually do that, right? That's you're talking grow lights and heat and da-da-da. Now, build a cold climate greenhouse that's appropriate for it. There's a lot of things that you can do, and you could do some things year round, but you have to understand the climate, the overall climate of where you're living, and also the microclimate of what you're trying to do. So again, if you want to grow food year round, you're going to have to create a microclimate and be able to do it appropriately, plan it, design it in a way that makes sense. Okay, and a lot of people miss that. They just go, I want to grow food year round. Well, you can do that if you live in Southern California and many other places, right? All right, secondly is geography. Okay, so we have climate, geography. And geography is made up of like the landscape, the terrain, and things like that. Okay, so like, for example, I live on sloped land. There's certain things that I have not built into the design because I live on sloped land. I'm not going to go try and grow corn up here and till a bunch of land and grow corn or soybeans or anything like that. I wouldn't do that anyway, but I'm not going to do that on sloped land for sure, right? That's flatland farming, or should be flatland type farming. Okay, number 3 is water. Okay, so again, scale of permanence, right? The climate largely is pretty fixed, or at least fixed enough to where, like, you know, what you're going to do over a 20, 30, 40 year period is not going to radically change. You know, of course, there's cycles and things will change over time, but we're not going to radically alter that, right? You're not going to change the climate unless, again, microclimate, building a cold climate greenhouse, you're doing season extension, things like that. All right, so the geography, you're not going to change. I mean, you can change some of it, right? You can bring in heavy equipment, and we've done that. You can terrace certain things. You can build ponds. There are certain things you can do, but it takes some effort to do that. The third is water. And so again, you know, for any given area, any given piece of land, the amount of water that that you have available to you is relatively fixed. Okay, and what I mean by that is, right, there's a certain amount of rainfall that occurs on an average over that time. There's you know, your well has a certain capability to it, etc. Okay, so it's relatively fixed. You can hold back some of that water, you can capture some of that water, you can do things to make it slow spread and soak in to the ground. There's some impacts you can have on it for sure. But it's, again, relatively fixed, and so we need to work with it. You're working with nature, not against it, right? So I have certain water flows. Well, where am I going to make a pond? I'm not going to necessarily make a pond way over there where the water's not at. I'm probably going to pond where the water is, where it's naturally flowing. Okay. The fourth is access. Okay, access. And I'll give you a quick tip here. If you're looking for property, if you are looking for land, trying to, the top 3 things that I think are the first things you look at outside of, you know, your budget, for example, would be access. Okay, access, water structures. Okay, so I'm going to access now. Okay, access, which is number 4, is you know, that's the roads that are on your property, or this maybe even the skid trails. Maybe it's the trails, how you're designing your gardens, your pastures, perimeter roads, that kind of stuff. Okay, once those are in, those are relatively permanent. Of course, you can change it. You can make roads here and there, but again, it's, you know, it's not so easy to do. Just, oh, well, you know, I'm just going to switch my driveway and do it somewhere else. Although in some cases that might be a good idea. Okay. The next one is number 5 is forestry. Okay, this is obviously very applicable for us up here, very applicable, and it's something that you have taken into consideration. Is if you have some understanding of forestry, and again, you don't have to be an expert in any of that. You just have to have some general basic knowledge. You understand what types of trees are growing on your property, gives you indications of you know, what type of habitat you're at. What you can do on your property. Okay, so there's a huge difference in a property that has a bunch of, say, cedar or hemlock on it, as opposed to a property that only has ponderosa pine. Okay, those are 2 different sites. Now, they can be, you know, 10 miles apart, and they are up here in North Idaho, for example. We're butted up against the Rocky Mountains. We have huge microclimate. I mean, I say huge. We have lots of different microclimates. They can be very close to one another. Say one very moist site like ours that has cedar and hemlock, and then you have another site that's just 10 miles from here. Again, like I said, ponderosa pine, which is a dry site. Okay, there's not a lot of water that that is basically on that site. It's a drier site. Okay, so even if we may get very similar rainfall, is totally different than what a site can handle and do, and whether it has water flowing through it, where it's at in the watershed, you know, all those types of things. Very important. Okay, so the next one is buildings. Okay, so structures. Where are you going to place your structures? Right? Are you going to build your structures in a wetland? I see people try and do that up here sometimes. Or are you're going to build your property in a very, very steep area where you have to take really, really steep roads to get there? You want to try and avoid those types of things if possible, or you pick, you mitigate that in some ways, right? So you might have a high elevational climb from, say, I don't know, the main roads to your property. We do a little bit. We're about 300 feet higher than kind of the main road, main roads that travel through here. And but we also have a kind of a windy flat road that comes up near our property that makes sense because it's following some of those main features that we talked about, right? And then our driveway is in such a way that it mitigates some of the areas where there's more erosion. Now, we do have a couple spots on our property that are conducive to erosion, and I have to really watch those. Okay, and that's again, so I have to put a lot of maintenance into those areas, which causes work and resources and that kind of thing. So we want to try and avoid those as much as we can. Okay, otherwise that's going to just be more work, and you have to be ready for that. All right, so buildings. Where are you going to place buildings? Where does it make sense? In flatter areas, are you going to pick really wet areas? Are you going to pick areas that are hard to access? Okay, there's a lot of places like here in North Idaho, for example, that are more like fair weather properties. Okay, they're not even accessible in winter unless you have like snowmobile, for example, right? I mean, unless you're doing like major heavy equipment to keep it open, right? As opposed to just say a plow on a truck. Right? We don't want to do that if you're going to live there year round. Okay, and then the next. Okay, so we have climate, geography, water access, forestry, buildings, and then fencing. Okay, now we get into like subdividing the property. Okay, subdividing, fencing our gardens to keep deer out, fencing pasture areas or silvopasture areas for livestock. And again, we want to take these things in mind, and we want to try and do them in a manner where it makes sense that goes along these lines. Okay, so we have, right, I'm not going to go against this. I'm not going to go against, okay, there's a river flowing down through here, and I can either go around it over here, or I'm going to try and bridge over it. All right, well, I'm going to go around it if I can, as opposed to bridging over it or putting culverts in or doing that kind of thing. So okay, so fencing is the same way, right? We're going to do where it makes sense. One of the things that you need to keep in mind is it in a place that's convenient for you? Okay, convenience to me is a huge factor. Can I see it? Right? Is it going to be in sight? Okay, because if it's in sight, it's in mind. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And this is really critical for gardens, especially the more intensive the garden. Okay, so for annuals, for example, annual vegetable gardens or things like that, you really want to put those in tight, and you want to put them in a place where you're going to see it. Okay. Soils. Okay, so climate, geography, water access, forestry, buildings, fencing, soils. Right now, a lot of people might say, well, you can't change your soils easily, and you're not going to change the ratio of sand, silt, and clay in soils, and that's true. You're not going to change the parent material. You're not going to change the bedrock that's on this mountain, for example. But what you can do is you can impact the soil itself, right? You can't impact the ratio of sand, silt, and clay, but you can impact the soil life that is in that sand, silt, and clay. You can get soils that are say, very heavy clay to act more like loamy soils by building in soil life and getting mycorrhizal fungi and all that kind of good stuff in there and kicking and moving by mulching, by adding organic matter, etc. So that's what I mean by soils, and you can change the soils in a relatively short period of time through good management practices. All right, so the next one is economy. Okay, so economy. Now, again, this company is more focused on building farms, but it's applicable. It's applicable to the homesteader, the person who's in suburbia and trying to meet some of their own needs from their own property. Very applicable to that, in my opinion. Okay, so how can you best set up your system to where you can get the most for yourself? It's important, right? So like the farmer is going to set it up and go, okay, economy, is there a market in my area for what I want to do here? Okay, I want to grow pasture-raised broilers, or I want to go pasture-raised pork. And is there a market for it in this area? You know, for is the market going to support, say, $7 or $8 a pound pasture-raised pork, or $5 to $7 a pound pasture-raised broilers? Right? You should consider that before starting that type of a farmstead venture. But also for you, if you're just growing your own food, you need to consider those things as well. Not the money side of it, but how can you do it? Can you grow the things you want to grow that are going to help you be self-sufficient in a manner that makes sense money-wise, right? Like I use the example, somebody wants to come up here and grow food year-round, and so they buy a Harbor Freight greenhouse and they blast it with propane all winter long to make sure that they can get some spinach and lettuce, you know, and or which is typical probably among a lot of backyard poultry raisers, is they end up with $10 a dozen eggs, based on, you know, they're using massive amounts of power to keep them warm over the winter, as if chickens need to be kept warm. You know, they're buying $32 a bag, 50-pound bag of organic feed. They're doing things that really skyrocket the cost, and since they don't track the cost, they don't know how much it costs. And then sometimes I even see them turn around and sell them for $3 a dozen, and they're losing money and they don't even realize it. Okay, that's not good. We need to be able to, if you want to be self-sufficient, you need to understand that. So I say economy, even if you're a homesteader and you're doing it for yourself, what you produce on your property to meet your own needs is like a business, should be treated that way. You should count the cost. You should, you know, see what the return is. Look at your revenue, look at your expenses, and do your financial statements based on what you're producing, okay? Track how much food that you actually produce. How much did it cost? And know how you're doing, right? And then in some cases, even if it's a little bit more money, it's still worth it to us because we're getting better food. We do have some food security that way. You know, all those things are still good. But if we're not doing it well, we could end up in a bad spot, okay? And again, I see a lot of people set that up. They're like, well, I'm food secure. It's like, if the stores literally completely run out of food for months and months and months, you're probably not going to have a propane to continue to feed your greenhouse over years, okay? Right? You got to think of those things. And again, I go back to what you have: primary, secondary, tertiary way of doing everything, right? And I'm not bagging on the greenhouse idea. It's perfectly fine. If someone wants to do that, go ahead. There's a better way to do it. You can design a better greenhouse that's more appropriate for that. Okay, the last one, energy. Okay, energy. Looking at the energy flows in your property. Okay, so not just okay, am I having grid power? Do I have an alternative energy system? You know, those are considerations as well. You know, what do I have available? Okay, like I mentioned before, you have someone who well, there's two different types of people. There are people that really want to go live off grid because they want a simpler lifestyle, and that's fine, and they go do excellent and well at that. Then you have other people who are like, oh, I want to go live off grid, but you kind of find out the real reason because they don't have any money, so they take an RV and they drive it out onto some raw land and try and make a go of it, and usually within a couple of years they're gone. You have to count those costs, okay? So the energy side of it. So do I have grid power available? If I don't, is that my plan? Do I want to build to be off grid and still have some modern conveniences, or do I want to be off grid in the Michael Bunker sense of basically doing without that power? So like you're going right to the old school systems of, you know, a pitcher pump that's get your water, or you know, cooking with a little rocket stove or over a wood cook stove, something like that. Okay, so count those costs in your design. Also, solar aspect, you know, that's, you know, energy. So we have solar coming into our property, we have wind coming into our property. Are those appropriate? Are those going to be design considerations? Right? Am I going to build a house right on the edge of a mountain, exactly where there's huge amounts of wind that come across? Or am I going to build the house a little lower that escapes the majority of the, you know, cold winds, especially if I'm in a cold climate? You know, am I going to set up my house to capture a lot of solar energy? Do I want to build in some passive solar elements to it? Or do I just want to build it, you know, simply for the view and not take any of that other stuff into consideration? Okay, so I hope I gave you something to think about when it comes to design. So scale of permanence, right? So we have climate, geography, water access, forestry, buildings, fencing, soils, economy, and energy. If nothing else, that is a framework to think about, okay, like in design or setting up the elements of your property. All right, I think I'll stop there because we've covered plenty in this video.